Agenda item 5.01, I think that we have a presentation. Dr. Kellogg, are you up first?
President Cotter, members of the board, thank you for taking time tonight to continue our discussion on facilities. Last time we were together, 2 weeks ago, we dove headfirst into the recommendations that had come from our citizens group from the fall, that had had an opportunity for community conversation. We looked at some of the modifications to those original recommendations based on that community feedback. And then 2 weeks ago, you had the opportunity to look at that and ask some questions. Upon reflection, it appeared to all of us that we need more time to vet this out and go through it. So this evening, we're going to return to that original conversation and try and keep things moving along in terms of where we're going next with facilities. So most of this is just a repeat of what we did. These first couple of slides are kind of a redo, maybe help understand a little bit better and see a little bit better what were in the committee recommendations. So in these sets of slides, we've organized what were the original committee recommendations from December that came from the citizens group, that they had organized around priority 1, priority 2, and priority 3 projects. And what I've tried to highlight in each of the slides in red are places where there are points that need conversation or modifications to the recommendations that reflect community input from this last round of community input. The other visual is you see there's a checkbox next to renovation of Westerville South High School. That's because last time we met in the discussion about the facilities projects, the board passed a resolution, and there's the part 2 of that, or the second reading of that resolution is tonight regarding renovation of Westerville South High School. This evening, I'm also adding some numbers in here. I want to caution anybody who's watching this, everything is an estimate. The estimates can change because of more details of the project. Estimates can also change because of timing of projects. So a cost today would be impacted by changes in costs that would naturally happen if the project was 4 years out. So these numbers are not to lock onto and say that's the number. These numbers give us some idea of scope of the project. So the committee recommendations back from the fall, after that series of meetings under priority 1 projects, we talked about South, so I'm going to skip past that one. One of the other recommendations was add a new middle school at the southern part of the district. We're costing that project at today's dollars at somewhere around $19.5 million. The key piece to this one that needs consideration and understanding is that opening a new middle school does have operational costs, as we talked about last time we met. So those operational costs, and I'm, again, an estimate number on salaries only. This is not salary and benefits, which would be the biggest part of any operational cost would be salaries and benefits for employees that would have to be there. These are operational costs that, as we look at our current financial forecast, of course, we haven't plugged those numbers in. So in May, when we're looking at our forecast, we need to consider the fact that if this is a path we head down, there is an operational cost that are not in our current financial forecast that need to be accounted for. So I want to put that in there. The other one was school safety needs. And this is, the timing on this was interesting, and just a reminder that we did this community input component in February. We actually had closed out the thought exchange with the community just prior to some of the tragic school situations we saw, for example, in Parkland. I have a feeling, had the timing been different, some of the sentiment from the community in this area would have been even stronger. Not that it wasn't strong, it was clearly very strong towards make sure you maintain an eye on building security across the district, all school buildings, not just those that are part of the projects. So we want to keep that in mind as we go along as well. So that was a high priority. Don't have a dollar number next to that. I could be honest with you, depending on the scope of work, this thing could be $1 million, you could spend $50 million, and anything in between. It just depends on scope of work, which is something that we're working on. So those are priority 1 projects. South is in the hopper as we've entering towards the design phase. We have some cost estimates to that, so that one's moving along. The other 2 are still part of a consideration. priority 2 projects from the committee recommendations and some subtle modifications that we mentioned last time. One was Whittier Elementary. Originally, Whittier was in the original recommendations from the committee as a renovation with expansion to increase capacity. Feedback through our community exchange indicated that there was strong sentiment that they liked the size of Whittier as it stands, and an expansion that would add capacity, meaning more students, wasn't favorable. The estimated capital cost on today's dollars for a renovation project at Whittier for current capacity is up there about $5.3 million. Hawthorne Elementary is still a project that would be renovation at about $5.6 million. There was community sentiment towards doing the project, not a lot of differences to it. Amherst was originally in the priority 3 group from the community group, but given the safety concerns and the educational environment and the amount of conversation that this particular item received during the community discussion, administration recommended bumping this up to priority 2, which pulls it out of when the funds allow and pushes it into funding earlier. The cost in that project, $6.8 million. That's a renovation, very similar to what we did at Point View. So it's not going to add seats, but it's going to add functionality. The cheapest project in the whole thing would be demo of Central College. As you know, we've had conversations with Head Start. We're working with them right now. So that one would move along. That's just the demo. We'd hold the land there. So the biggest change in that one was not making Whittier an expansion to more students and moving Amherst up from priority 3 to a priority 2. Some other priority 2 projects. This is when things get a little murkier. The Longfellow, one of the original committee recommendations, there were recommendations to Hanby and Emerson about exiting those buildings and moving the programs. The original recommendations from the citizens group did not call out where those programs would go. They felt that that would be something that we would work with the community. As we project forward, right now we would recommend that a renovation and expansion of Longfellow would be to a magnitude that it could house the Hanby Magnet program. The cost of that project, which would still retain the 4 classrooms for all-day kindergarten, is about $9.8 million. As we've talked about before, green space, land, et cetera, we can fit there pretty easily. The big question is a question of timing. In terms of if you're exiting Hanby, what is the future of that facility? What's the district's relationship to that facility? And do you account for that before you begin on the Longfellow project, or do you move and figure out the other parts later? So the question of timing in that. And remember now, we're talking about a 10-year program, so where we plug some of these projects in can be done in that scale. So it's not that everybody has to start tomorrow. Under Emerson, this is probably the biggest change in all the recommendations. The original recommendations from the community group was, of course, to exit Emerson and leave the building. Based on feedback through the exchange, looking at the data from Triad and from OFCC in terms of the viability of those buildings, the recommendation now is to remain in Emerson with current programming as is. What that leaves open is the question about investing in that building in its current condition. The current 10-year estimates for capital improvements there runs about $2.5 to $3 million over the next 10 years. That doesn't account for any expansion for functionality. We know we deal with cafeteria, art rooms, restrooms. So what we would think might make sense for Emerson is remain there at this time and do some feasibility study for potential additional capital investment. What's the return on investment in that, and whether or not there's opportunity within that to have a reasonable change in the footprint to add functionality, whether or not that cost benefit would be worthwhile long term, given its the property it sits on, et cetera. Slightly different than Hanby, which has both the issues of landlocked with very little opportunity for expansion and classroom size. So that one lays in front of us as still an area to be discussed. Then is the recommendation on the priority two projects for new elementary. Like a new middle school, has the same double whammy to your budgets. Capital costs, about $12.7 million in today's numbers. Our estimation and operational costs for just salaries, not salaries and benefits, is about $2 million. Again, like the middle school, we have not plugged in those numbers in any financial forecast, so we haven't accounted for that moving forward if that's the direction we want to go. So in both those cases, we have additional operating costs that need to be addressed and talked about. The last one was the priority three projects. These were also titled When Funds Allow. In the first case, all-day kindergarten, which got a lot of very positive feedback from the community, there's a couple pieces in this one. One is just classroom space. With our current fleet, with no additional buildings, there's limitations into how many more classroom spaces we can squeeze out to make all-day kindergarten. That would be problematic, particularly if you don't add the new elementary school and you're not shifting kids around, so you have that problem. The other one is each additional classroom, of course, is a new teacher. It's a salary cost. There's probably some of that we can fit into current projections for staffing down the line that we have in the forecast, but not the total package. Our estimates are probably somewhere between 15 and 17 additional classrooms and teachers, about $1.5 million in salaries. Again, not in the current forecast. The other component that I didn't put up there that I apologize, I should have, is the other component of all-day kindergarten needs consideration is the fact that right now it's a tuition-based program on a sliding scale. The more we move towards full all-day kindergarten across the district, begs the question of what do we do about the tuition piece? That's another operational cost that would have to be considered if you get to the point where you're full all-day kindergarten. District-wide furniture replacement got a lot of positive feedback, both in terms of staff chats we had and in the thought exchange component. That's a price tag that has, again, it's kind of like school safety. You could spend $1 million, you could spend $12 million. It's just a matter of magnitude and what we would want to do there. One that was not part of the original recommendations, and so I'll be transparent that administration thinks that this should be something to consider in a capital improvement plan. Within our roadmap, one of the areas that we've identified as an area of weakness for classrooms, and this goes to 21st century spaces, is we have real inconsistencies in the quality of the AV equipment in the classroom. So this would be projection devices, audio devices, screen technology, et cetera. Looking at funds to upgrade classroom AV equipment to more 21st century standards over a time period as well. And again, there's a figure in there. It can be less than that. It could probably be a little bit more than that, depending on what's available to us. Again, that comes from the Learning and Teaching Roadmap, was not a part of the original recommendations, but it does fit into that conversation about 21st century classroom space and what we like to do. The furniture component and the AV component adds a lot of value. So, kind of to summarize, South's got that ball rolling. You have a couple other projects in there. I think the tweaks, minor with the Whittier tweak, not expansion, minor, Amherst moving up to a priority 2 on our recommendation. More difficult to negotiate is going to be the Emerson, Hamby, Longfellow combination and timing of those projects is also going to be put together. And on any new buildings or kindergarten, you're staring at operational costs that have to be accounted for moving forward. And so any long-range 10-year plan can't simply plug in the projects, it's got to plug in the financing. And so that leads me to the portion that we buzzed through last time that maybe not got as much conversation as should have. But let's consider how you would frame a 10-year plan in both the capital, which is the fixed assets, big stuff, and operational, which is the daily running stuff of cost considerations. And as we know, and we've talked about, one way to fund the capital improvements, the actual facilities part, is through a COPS, a certificate of participation. We pay that loan down over time. We can negotiate the terms, the size. We use our available permanent improvement revenue, which means, of course, we're using permanent improvement revenue to pay a loan, and that's not money that's available every year for building improvement projects in our capital plan. So that balance point between how much of a COPS do we ask for and give up on permanent improvement revenue is a key number. But what we know is it's probably reasonable to assume, and my recommendation would be, and feel free to ask Ms. Hendricks on her recommendation as well, it does not appear to us that it makes sense to fund, you couldn't fund the scope of all these projects with just a COPS. There's a portion of this we can fund. The more the projects we want to do, the more likely it is that we'll have to consider additional revenue sources from the community in the form of a bond issue or issues. Remember, we're talking about a 10-year time frame, so things can be parceled out over time in order to fund that over the 10 years. So that's capital budget considerations that we have available to us to look at how much of these projects do we want to fund and what's the timeline we want to do that with over 10 years. As we've talked about, a COPS issue is a pretty simple board action, pretty quick to get it done, about just really a couple of weeks before you have access to the money. Any kind of bond issue going out to the community is a longer time period we know about, right? So that's how we can fund the capital portion of this, the big stuff. So what do we need to know about our general fund considerations? Because now you're into that other piggy bank, so to speak. What we do know is without consideration towards new buildings or all-day kindergarten, those additional operating costs I just referred to, if you look at our current 5-year forecast, we are projecting, as we've talked about for a while, the need for an operating levy sometime in probably the fall of 20, outside chance of being able to wait till fall of 21 before, in order to maintain current programming, we would need additional revenue. That's when the difference between our expenditures and revenues get to a point that we're dipping too deeply into our fund balance. The longer we run in that deficit model, the more the fund balance we run out, and at a certain point, you've depleted your fund balance, and the deficit between your spending and your revenue is so big that the ask you have for the community is unreasonable. So that's a key target for us. And as I said, we know there's operating costs in Bullet 2. There's probably opportunity for small increases in all-day kindergarten if we have classroom space using current FTE projections we have in the forecast. We do have additional FTE teaching staff, I should use the term, not FTE, staff in there in the forecast now each year. But the total for all-day kindergarten would exceed what we have in there. So you have those two balances to look at. So how do you kind of piece that together? So how do you align revenue for facilities, the capital improvement side, with revenue you would need for operating? And here's one way to look at it. It's kind of stair-step approach. Again, over 10 years, this is not an everything at once. This is what do we want to do now, what would be done later, and what projects would be tied to that. So the simplest is you do nothing, which probably is not the best advice. The simplest is just to do a COPS issue. The magnitude of that is something we can talk about. Where's our kind of threshold collectively for how much do we want to invest in that kind of financing? We have people who can work with us. Ms. Hendricks has done some work on this. We can bring other people in for the board to talk to. We have some idea, some numbers, but probably needs more discussion. You can, of course, increase the magnitude of the project by associating a bond issue, which can be partnered with a COPS. We went through, we've talked to the community a lot about our ability to fund some of the project without going on the ballot. So this is that test point of how much can we fund with a COPS and how much would we want to fund if we wanted a bond issue. So you could partner those two components. They don't have to go hand in hand. There can be different years to this. It's just a matter of timing. And that would give you additional revenue for other projects other than for those projects that have no operating implications. So if you think about all the pieces that are in the puzzle, the pieces that would come off in this piece would be money for new middle, money for new elementary, money for all-day kindergarten, which have operating expenses. Any of the other projects, which are just capital investments and don't involve operating expenses, can fit into this model, and you can really address all of those other components. The last one is the most robust one, which again, and you can parcel this out in any way you like, is the idea of a bond and an operating levy issue or issues. You have two different schools in there, actually three different components in there. So you could parcel out operating dollars for, let's say, new middle school first, later on to plan additional operating dollars for new elementary school as part of an offering to the community. Of course, the COPS issue, which I think is kind of a one we're going to follow through on no matter what, to finance those recommended projects, including the new operating costs. And so, if you can imagine over a 10-year frame, depending on how much of the project you want to do and the timing of those components, you can lay all this out into a 10-year plan and see where it goes, all right? The promise that we had made to this point in our timeline was June is our targeted day for the board to actually be in a position to talk about what next steps they want to take after 2 rounds of community engagement. So where we really stand isn't, the question of the board isn't which of these do you want to do and fund right now. The question of the board is, as you see the projects and the recommendations and the modifications of those recommendations from the community engagement process, what do you want to move forward with now, if anything, with additional community input so you have some more information so you can make some decisions down the line about projects. So it really becomes this, is the idea of next phase of community engagement around what are the thoughts regarding support of these projects given their capital and operating and financial implications. Might represent the kind of large-scale question we're really staring at this point. Not to say that is the question, but to make the point that I think where we're really at is, okay, how do you feel about the recommendations and the modifications to those to date? And what is it, are we ready and feel prepared enough as a board to turn around and turn this back to the community for more conversation, or is there additional information that you all need before we do that? So I leave it open for questions and comments at this time.
Who's starting? Start?
I think you should.
I think I should. That's good. I have written down a number of things. Some of them are more thoughts than questions, but as I think about going back out for additional input from the community, I think the thought exchange approach was unusually helpful to us in giving us a broad range of individuals who participated and who shared their thoughts. What I don't want to do, though, is go with some things that feel a bit vague within the recommendations and the planning. So I'm wrestling tonight with what is most effective to put out for input that won't create unnecessary confusion, basically. And I'm going to the one that you all knew I would go to tonight anyway, which is the Hanby piece, which is, in my mind, highly vague in the way it's discussed. And I am a little worried about going out with something as vague about that and then talking about funding things. So, that's an example. So if there is appetite for working on the questions, not tonight, working on the questions, getting input from us around what those questions might be, how those could be effectively shaped, then I am all for going out as soon as possible to get some additional input, especially before we get into the season when most people aren't paying as much attention to what we're talking about, just because of the way life goes in the springtime and the early summer. I'm also a little concerned, and I'm very much interested in the input from the community around this, on the size of the COPS and where we would go with that. I do think that the COPS is an important tool for us to have, and I think that we should be utilizing it. But what I don't want to do is, the analogy that always comes to mind for me is a credit card. I don't want to run up the credit card and then have nothing left for additional needs that we will have and do have in capital improvements. So I want us to be careful also when we go out for input in how we shape discussion and explanation of what the COPS is and what its pros and cons may be. The operating piece, that is a huge issue, because when we talk about $3.5 million and we talk about $2 million, that's annualized. We have to talk about how that continues to accrue each year and will expand as time goes along. So we need to figure out how we want to talk about that as well. So in other words, there's a lot of really good stuff here, and there's a whole lot of stuff that I hope people are going to be supportive of and have good thoughts about. If I had my druthers, what I would do is I would move Amherst into a priority 1. And if I had my other druthers, I would be very clear about Hanby, and I would find an appropriate creative use for Hanby that maintains Hanby within the district fleet and utilizes Hanby as the educational center that it is and should be. And I think that we can do that creatively. But that's my druther, and I want to hear what the community has to say about that further than it has already said. I'd also like to see if, as we look at renovations, if it might be possible within those renovations to begin to do incremental steps toward additional ADK classrooms. When we renovate, when we get to the point where we can renovate Whittier, Hawthorne, Amherst, to consider whether it might be possible to include some small additional space in each of those buildings to deal not just with ADK but with special ed, as we need additional spaces in those buildings. So we would not be increasing overall student population except, with ADK perhaps, but not really. I don't think we would that much. But to find an incremental stepping stone, if you will, toward additional ADK classrooms. I also think that we should consider how we might look at our fleet a little differently as regards ADK. If we're looking differently at Hanby, if we're looking differently here, if we're looking differently at Longfellow, if we're looking differently at renovations, then we need to be looking differently at how we can deal with ADK. So those are some of the thoughts that I have, but I am most concerned this evening in how the questions and how the information is provided, so that we provide it in such a way that people are able to respond well and in a way that they find satisfying to the information that we have to share, because there's a lot of it and there are a lot of moving pieces within it. And see, I didn't go off on Hanby too much, and you guys probably all thought I would.
I didn't even think you would.
You didn't think I would? Oh, gotcha.
Okay, I kind of a little bit.
Yeah, you thought I would, yeah. Yeah, I know you did.
Who's next?
I'm just going to be quick. Just a couple of quick items. First is a little confused about the dynamic and the interplay, both from a costing standpoint and a location standpoint, of the modifications and renovations to Hawthorne and then the addition of an elementary in the southern end of the district. Because when I net that back, we're 22x million in doing a new elementary plus a Hawthorne renovation. So I think that's something that we need to take a look at from an attendance standpoint and what that would look like. Because I definitely have my optics on the Hawthorne renovation relative to the students being serviced in the southern end of the district. Plus the numbers are really clear where we stand on the need for the middle school. But the additional elementary school, I'd like to get some more clarification on. Second is Longfellow. And John, this might be a takeaway, but do we perceive the need for Longfellow to continue to be a multi-classroom all-day kindergarten site if we go all-day kindergarten district-wide?
No.
Okay.
So to Dr. Nestor Baker's point about if we do something at Amherst or Whittier, whereas we may not be expanding it to a 600-student school, the idea of that renovation, including additional classroom space so that we can now take make another one or two more kindergarten classrooms so that those buildings could expand their all-day kindergarten. We can absorb back from Longfellow if we need to in order to keep it more at the home school
Okay.
So
Yeah.
it doesn't require,
Sure. And that kind of dovetails into my first question, which is that if we're changing attendance mix relative to elementary schools and we add in capacity at Longfellow, then does that change our numbers and our perspective on projects relative to elementary schools? Right. I think that one's a takeaway because that's a projection conversation.
right?
Emerson, just a thought, in fostering additional student and organization input into the district, looking at what the SHOP program at North did with the Cornicocosing project with Otterbein, could we basically promote our own internal brainstorming using resources that we have in the form of students as well as Otterbein to bring them into the fold? I think it's a way to respectfully recognize the historic importance of that building by having more than just the school district taking a look at it in terms of what we could do with it. So that's more of an observation. That's all I've got.
Not yet.
I'm going to follow up with what Nancy said, but I might be a little bit all over the place. So I see the historic piece and importance of Hanby here in the heart of Westerville. What I would like to see us look at is maybe taking or extending the offer to our Head Start program. After we get rid of Central College, maybe Head Start would be interested in Hanby. I do really like the idea of putting Longfellow closer up on the list and expanding it because I would like to expand magnet opportunities. I think that they're very beneficial to our school district. I think it helps us shine and stand out a little bit differently. So I'd be very interested in moving forward with that. Couple other things. Little concerned about new middle school in the southern end. I think it's a great idea. I am very supportive of it, but as far as operating costs, I think that's going to be a stretch for us, and I think we need to continue that conversation and figure out how that looks financially, and maybe we'll get to take a deeper look at that as we see the next 5-year forecast. I would love to see that happen. District-wide furniture upgrades, supportive of them, but I would like to see them happen as schools are renovated, not district all at one time. I too would like to see Amherst move up on the list. I think it should be a top priority. As far as Emerson, I would like us to just get ideas and get a little creative out there, looking at what could happen. We're talking about just making some improvements to art room and cafeteria, but are there other opportunities around? So,
You're referring to staying there, but looking at the facility and what else could be done to it, as opposed to what could be done with it if we exit it.
yes.
Okay.
And as far
Thank
as
you.
the land around it, yes. The COPS, I think we need to revisit that again. I would like to see the amount we're looking at, and I think that's something we should look at a little bit sooner as we plan out this 10-year plan, just to kind of see financially what we can get done and where. We don't have anything in there about the OFCC, and I know that's not there yet, but maybe as we look at the 10-year plan, maybe we look at that for the new middle school or elementary school, which, again, do we still need to renovate Hawthorne then? I think those are all great questions. Could we get creative with the all-day K program? For example, could our half-day kids be in all-day K classrooms and we move services like extra, like the gym, what am I looking there for? the,
Support services?
no, the extra activities they have, could those be planned maybe in the afternoon for some schools? Because I know if the academics are earlier in the day or in the afternoon, you know, half-day could be split somehow within an all-day classroom,
Are you-
within all-day K.
So that the half-day students would be there? I'm not following, missing
So
something.
I'm picturing an all-day kindergarten classroom where kids could come, some of them could actually come a half-day. After talking with Barb Wallace, I hear that the need for half-day is not as great, but we still want to offer that opportunity. So maybe in a couple of our buildings, we could say, hey, you can come here half-day, and then at such and such time you leave. It could be morning, afternoon, we still could be flexible with that.
So within an all-day classroom, a student would have a half-day option to leave.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's lots of school districts that do that now. I think, and I may be wrong, I think I'm right. I think state law requires that if a parent doesn't want all day, they can take half-day. I think
Sure.
I'm correct. So we would have to plan for that in programming anyway.
Sure.
If that's what you were talking, is that, okay.
Just an option out there, just to
Gotcha.
give a couple options.
Yep.
And I think that's it, I think.
Well, I think we all could probably go on and on about a lot of the things that we think and ideas that we have.
Sure.
Not you. Okay.
Okay, just do that, what they said,
Oh, okay.
just, okay?
Made my life easy.
Well, that's still a lot to chew on, it sounds like. Mr. LaRose, I'm going to ask something about South, so I'd like you to come to the podium and come up now, but I have questions about this at this point. Yeah, really several things that were said were I think spot on. I would like to have a deeper understanding of. Well, this is really for you. I'm gonna blast away at Mr. LaRose in just a minute. That's what I do, right? Just a deeper understanding of COP's possibilities and how that could work for us. Gosh, I'm just really disappointed that. You talked about operational costs, $6 million. That's just I added them all up. $6 million, and that's just salary. That's and it's not in there right now. So I'm just expressing. Gosh, I'm just really disappointed, and was more hopeful that we would be able to do something new for the folks who are in the southern end of the district. Which is why I think the Hawthorne renovation is an important priority to me, not because it's adding, but because that building needs renovation. I'm looking at renovation in the sense of it may not add a lot of classroom space, but it can sure add a whale of a lot of creativity and innovation and inspiration to the students that are in a less than inspiring facility right now. That's why I like the idea of Hawthorne being renovated, regardless of what is built new down there, potentially. The other piece, I am firmly in the camp of Emerson remaining in our fleet and potentially being upgraded, renovated, if that is a possibility, depending on land around there, if that's a focus. I don't want us to lose sight of the security one. I don't want us to get caught behind the ball on the security one. Enough said about that. And a couple other pieces, I suppose, down here. I'd be interested in hearing more about the AV equipment disparity piece. Because I do think, does that, in that estimation, does that include additional Chromebooks, or is that a different kind of piece?
This is,
That's it.
This is just upgrade of these kinds of
Okay.
projector systems and wall mounts and where we would go to next.
Okay, that's, I thought you meant, I wasn't sure. I think we just have some more work to do on this, and I'm wanting to move more quickly. I always want to move more quickly than probably should, but I think that there have been some good issues and thoughts raised here. And the last thing I mentioned, is it okay if let me address Mr. LaRose for just a minute on South? Mr. LaRose, I did not tell you I was going to ask you this question, but I really, you're fine with that.
Aren't you glad to know that?
Yeah, I'll tell you in a minute here.
I'm going to, yeah. You have built up a lot of credibility with me in your innovative designing and inspirational passion and your stick-to-itiveness in budget issues. And even when in our last pretty major renovation, there were struggles with contractors, et cetera. I felt that you, and I would say your team and the administration, stayed on top of that. And so I'm just going to ask you point blank, because I'd like this on the record. I have mostly, significantly large percentage of people saying to me about the South renovation, all in favor of it, move forward with it, let's do this. I was even very impressed with, I think it was Mr. Vibrantz's presentation at our last, and Greg, correct me if I'm wrong, not out loud, but correct me if I'm wrong behind the scenes, that people from representative of Central and North were highly in favor of the South renovation. Is that correct, Mr. Vibrantz? Thank you. To repeat, I get a lot of positive feedback about this renovation. Here's where the question is that I get from a couple people. You are not going to be, this is how it's framed, you are not going to be able to do anything with those skinny hallways. You are not going to be able to really fix the bathrooms and water. And you are not going to be able to do anything with the HVAC system. And so you've said to us already, but I'd like you to share, is safe, warm, and dry also in your plans for the beginning stages of this South renovation? Not just inspirational, innovative, creative, which it needs to be, but speak to those who may be listening about the HVAC, the water, the plumbing, the hallways, etc. Go.
Go, okay. Yes, we are going to improve the traffic flow in the hallways. We're looking at several options to do that, but it will be improved. Yes, we're going to replace the HVAC system. Yes to safe, warm, and dry. So the 35 to 37 million, going back to Triad's assessment over 10 years, there's 20 million in the 35 to 37 million that is dedicated for the things you're talking about, safe, warm, and dry. So there's roughly 15 to 17 million for that inspirational component that you referenced. So it's all in there, and I appreciate your comments with our prior work, but I truly believe that the best is yet to come.
Thank you. I will just repeat again that you have built up that credibility with me. I'm not speaking for the board, but you have with them too. Right?
Yes.
And I know that Mr. Byrd served alongside of you for a while. I know that Mrs. Davidson served alongside of you and your team. We always want to respect the team. In facilities liaison for a while. And I'm sorry I'm taking this much time, but I want to repeat why I've supported a renovation instead of a replacement.
Can I address one other issue that I've heard about that you didn't mention?
Yes, absolutely.
And that was the size of some of the classrooms. So I referenced at the last meeting, we're expanding in the scope of work. We're projecting to expand about 50,000 square feet. And as we're looking at these smaller size classrooms and these academic wings, what we're looking at is converting a bank of 3 classrooms into 2 classrooms and then picking up those additional classrooms within that additional square footage. So it's some comments I've heard. I heard that at our site council meeting last week with some of the teachers. That's also getting addressed. I'm sorry to interrupt.
No. Thank you. I say this and then really done. I just want to state for my own self that I believe in the renovation path based on the historical work that's been done, 1. 2, because I think we are trying to be as fiscally prudent and creative as we can. And 3, because I think that $20 million difference can make a big difference in some of the other parts of the district. And this is not just about South and South students and staff, who I happen to be quite close to. But I care about the other ones as well. And I'm just going to stick my neck out. The rest of the team can do what they want. But that's why I am going with renovation. And that's the last thing I should probably say about that.
Rick, if I can tag along real quick, Jeff, just simply because you're up there, because I've had this this hypothetical situation that's been kind of rolling around in my head for months as we've gone through this process, because we've all been going through this process and tons of work behind the scenes, and staff, administration, everybody. But something that's been kind of stuck in my head has been the first issue that we're challenged with is that we do not have the luxury of unlimited finances. We know this is the case. Not having the luxury of unlimited finances means that the board is obligated to be the elected body that makes the compromises. So while that may cause frustration in the community, the compromises have to be made. This is a $225 million school district with significant complexity. If we could do it all, and everybody would be satisfied and happy to pay the bill, we'd do it all. We know that that is not the case. So the challenge here relative to this hypothetical situation that I've had in my head has been related to the logistics of actually building a new South High School instead of renovating. The scenarios that we've talked about would be similar to what Reynoldsburg had done, which is using the back portion of the property to build the brand new building, because we, again, don't have luxuries, and those luxuries include not being able to tear down the entire school and just postpone a bunch of high school kids, you know, and their years for 1 or 2 years until we got it built. So once that building is built, just like in Reynoldsburg, we raise the building in front. So my question in this hypothetical is that in your mind, based upon your experience in the role, would the city of Westerville then have an outsized and substantial position on what we could or could not do with the property that now is a massive buffer between the new building and the sidewalk? Would they have an outsized voice on what we would be allowed to do with that property, yes or no?
Yes.
Okay. So my follow-on question to that, how long did it take us to get the Westerville South sign through? Almost through, how many years?
4 to 5, yeah.
4 to 5.
Yeah.
So we have a massive component of property now that would be sitting there waiting for additional development, and it took us 4 to 5 years to get a sign, almost. So the logistics aren't, the logistics are a significant contributor to the realities of what we can and cannot do with the property as well. I do think, Rick, I totally agree with you. We have an obligation to be able to, or an obligation to be, exercise wisdom in terms of the greatest overall impact to the greatest number of students in the entire district. And I agree with you, renovation is definitely the way to go, but I think it also, needs to be taken into account how incredibly difficult it would be for a massive new build on that property and the consequences that we could invoke. I don't think that the community would be happy if several acres sat empty and were green space and had flowers on them, and that's all that we could use them for because we're unable to navigate a path with our city colleagues for new parking or whatever else the case may be. So, thank you, Jeff, I appreciate it.
Sure. Thank you, that's.
Rick, are you finished? Okay. I have a few comments. So I definitely agree with Nancy's comments about needing more time to develop more detailed questions. I do think that a number of the recommendations could use some more details. I also think it would be helpful in gathering feedback if we had multiple options along with pros and cons as we develop those questions. That's kind of a general thing. That's for the facility recommendations as well as for the financing recommendations. I'd like to see multiple options along with pros and cons for that. As far as Hanby goes, definitely a historic building in the district. I'm a little bit more attached to the magnet program than I am to the building. Sorry, Nancy.
I see no reason to diminish either.
Without diminishing Hanby, certainly not calling for it to be torn down or anything, I am interested in options for expansion of Longfellow and/or other elementary schools. We seem to have taken the direction that we will only be renovating elementary schools in the recommendations. And since I'm not sure when we would be able to do a new elementary, I would like us to reconsider options for expanding some of the elementary schools with pros and cons and include that in the next feedback round.